If you like these videos, please check out my full course at www.lsat.totaltestprep.net with tons of clearly explained actual LSAT questions written by someone who's mastered test and helped others master it, and an evaluation period where you only pay if you want to continue.
Alright, so in this video we'll cover the necessary assumption questions. So what is the necessary assumption questions? Okay, so as usual, what do these questions ask for? So what does it mean for an assumption to be necessary? How do these questions appear in the test? And how do we approach these questions? Alright, so in terms of basic information, necessary assumption questions ask you for the answer choice which has to be true in order for the conclusion to be true. Now, it's important in a legal context to be able to identify the assumptions made in an argument in order to adequately respond to it and what the implications of an argument are and all that stuff. So the questions are always going to deal with arguments because in order to identify a requirement for the conclusion, there must be an argument. The question will generally deal with one speaker argument, though there might be multiple, and if there are multiple speakers or multiple arguments, the question is going to tell you where to focus. Excuse me. And the correct choice will have to be true. The others may be true or false, so they won't have to be true. So choice could be true, but that doesn't mean an incorrect choice could be true, but that doesn't mean that it has to be true. Okay, in terms of the basic approach, you need to have a clear understanding of the argument, and you need to be able to identify the choice that has to be true. So you identify the conclusion, premises, and you want to look for a gap. Now there won't always be a gap, so being clear on the conclusion is actually key. But you do want to look for a gap because a lot of times a common variation for these involves a gap. That being said, like I said, focusing on the conclusion is important because a lot of the answer choices will in some sense be the conclusion will be very relevant, very important for them. So you then go through the choices and you look for the one that has to be true. So the correct choice is going to have to be true. That means that if you negate that choice, that's going to cause a problem for the conclusion. So if you negate a choice and it causes a problem for the conclusion, that's the right answer. The right answer cannot be negated because if you negate it, you're going to have a problem with the conclusion. That's what it means that it has to be true. Now, you don't always necessarily need to negate the choice, but it helps to explicitly do it if you're down a couple of answers. So that's one way, and we'll cover this in detail when we go through the questions, but that's what I call the negation check test because something that has to be true can't be false. All the rest of them, you can come up with a scenario where the answer choice isn't true. So all the incorrect ones could potentially be false, except the correct one. For the incorrect choice, like I said, it won't have to be true. So if you negate the choice, but you can still reach the conclusion, then you know that that's not the correct answer. Incorrect choices can be negated, and it won't be a problem for the conclusion. And sometimes the choice actually strengthens the argument, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be true. There's something to keep in mind. Just because something strengthens an argument does not necessarily mean that it is something that has to be true. Because information can strengthen an argument without being necessary for the argument. It could simply just give you additional reason to accept the conclusion. And an incorrect choice could also weaken the argument or be irrelevant. So you want to be on the lookout for that. So most of the time it's going to be irrelevant and it's going to seem like it has to be true, although it won't. And the tricky ones will actually strengthen the argument. So you can just be careful. Necessary assumption does not necessarily mean that it strengthens the argument, or rather something that strengthens is not necessarily a necessary assumption. In terms of the basic variations, so a choice can provide a link between the premises and conclusion. So this is found across the different argument types, although it's a bit less commonly in the correlation causation one. So you'll find a bunch of, this is the one where there's a gap. And this is actually very similar to the sufficient assumption question type. This is almost identical to the sufficient assumption question type, and sometimes an assumption could both be sufficient and necessary. So you're closing the gap between the premises and conclusion. Simplest variation is where the premises talk about one thing and the conclusion is about something else, and then you just have to equate the two. So it could be a causal chain, it could be attribute associations between things. Essentially any situation where you're just equating the two different things that are talked about in the premise and conclusion is an example of simply providing a link, a necessary link in order to get to the conclusion. Another common variation involves conditional reasoning. So an argument will include more or less obvious conditional language, and the premise and conclusions may not themselves have conditional statements, but can be linked together. via conditional statement. Or there might be conditional statements in the premises and conclusion, and the conditions need to be equated or linked by another condition, or a particular statement might have to be activated if it's a conditional statement. So, and a variation for this involves giving a specific example of a condition, once again, like in the sufficient condition questions. So this first variation of necessary assumption questions, are actually very similar to these sufficient assumption question types in the sense that you're essentially bridging the premises and conclusion.